Hi there, everybody. In this video, we're going to be continuing our discussion of Kantian ethics and our focus on this initial formulation of the categorical imperative in terms of universalizability. In this video, we'll start out by discussing the difference between hypothetical and categorical imperatives. Then we'll talk about how rationality relates to this idea of the principle of universalizability, and how the idea of autonomy relates to the principle of universalizability. And then we'll talk about some advantages of this principle, using it to derive our moral obligations. Some of the critical concepts for understanding Kantian ethics is that for Kant, morality and ethical theory is intimately tied to this idea of reason and rationality. We are rational animals, and it's our rationality, it's this rational nature that is responsible for the moral law that applies to us. And now, this law consists of imperatives or commands, and we need to understand how those commands relate to that rational nature. And then we also need to think about how our autonomy or control relates to our rationality and to morality more generally as well. So to fully understand his theory, we need to think about what all these ideas mean and how they connect to this categorical imperative. As I mentioned, Kant thought of morality in terms of imperatives or commands that come from our reason, from our rational nature. So we are all rational creatures. I have a faculty of reason, you have a faculty of reason. We're very different in other ways, but we all have the ability to reason. So just to give a metaphor here, think of our faculty of reason giving us commands, telling us to do certain things. When we follow the commands that our own reason is giving us, we are thereby being rational. And to the extent that we are disobeying these commands given to us by reason, we are being irrational. Some of the commands that our reason gives to us are hypothetical in nature. So think hypothetical, think hypothesis. It's not necessarily something that's true, it's something that could be true. So a hypothetical imperative is a command of reason that's going to apply to a person if they have certain desires or goals. So let's consider an example. Imagine a college student, Sally. She's trying to pick courses for next semester. We might say, well, what's rational for her to sign up for with her schedule? Now imagine that she can only pick either a computer science class or an English class. There's a conflict in her schedule where she could only pick one. Well, would it be rational for her to register for the computer science class or for the English class? Well, you might say, if Sally has the goal of getting a computer science degree, then she should register for the computer science class. But if she were to have different desires or different goals, like if Sally has the goal of getting an English degree, well, then she should register for the English class. So there's this command of rationality, of reason, that only applies to Sally if she has the relevant goal or desires. Similarly, should Micah complete law school or drop out? What would be the rational thing for her to do? Well, this depends upon what her goals or desires are. If Micah wants to become a lawyer, well, then she should finish law school, because you need to finish law school in order to achieve that goal of becoming a lawyer. But if Micah decides that she wants to become a medical doctor and have as little debt as possible, well, then she should drop out. Now, let's imagine that you're going to go on a vacation to Portland and you're coming from Auburn. Well, what would be the rational thing to do as far as travel goes? Should you travel by flying or driving? Here, too, it depends upon what your goals or desires are. If you have the goal or desire to travel from Auburn to Portland quickly so you can spend as much time in Portland as you are able to, well, then rationality would command that you fly, since that's the best way to achieve those goals. But if you had other goals, like maybe your goal isn't to get there quickly and spend as much time as you can there, if your goal is to travel slowly and visit landmarks between the two where you don't care about how much time you spend in Portland itself, well, then you should drive. That would be a much better means to achieving your goals of visiting these landmarks and seeing these places in between. In all of these cases, the imperative or command or the demand that your reason makes of you is dependent upon what desires or goals you have. Hypothetical imperatives are essentially what reason demands you do as a means to achieving a goal or desire that you have. But Kant thought that moral imperatives were categorical in form. A categorical imperative is a command of reason that's going to apply to a person independently of any desires or goals that person has. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. So Kant thought that moral imperatives were like this, that don't kill, don't lie, don't steal, and help those in need were categorical imperatives. These were commands that came to us from our reason, from our rational nature, but those commands applied to us regardless of whether they would help us achieve our goals or make us happy. Now note, these moral demands are all categorical imperatives. However, as we mentioned in the last video, Kant thought the first three were perfect duties, but he thought the fourth one here was an imperfect duty. These moral demands, as I said, are all categorical imperatives. However, they are not the categorical imperative. So the categorical imperative is the foundational moral principle from which these other moral duties, these specific moral duties, derive. Our first formulation of the categorical imperative, where this is the foundational principle of morality, is that principle of universalizability that says an action is morally permissible if and only if it's possible for you to rationally will that its maxim become a universal law. So in this video, we're not going to go through the details of what is a maxim, what is a universal law, what is it to rationally will a maxim. That was the last video. In this video, I want to make a couple connections here so we can stress how the ideas of reason and rationality are connected to this principle of morality that Kant is proposing. So firstly, notice it's irrational to be inconsistent. You can be inconsistent in your beliefs. If you believe that something is both true and you believe that it's false at the same time, well, then you're being inconsistent. Now, even if you don't care about consistency, that is, well, if you have reason and you can think about these things, it seems like you're still being irrational regardless of what your goals and desires are. There's something irrational about inconsistency for its own sake. But similarly, that is, we can be inconsistent in the maxims guiding our actions. And that's exactly what the principle of universalizability is attempting to test. So if this principle of universalizability is testing for the consistency of our principles and maxims, and that is a foundation of morality, then that would imply that anybody who acts immorally will always be acting irrationally. Moreover, there's some further connections we need to point out here. It's because we have reason that we're able to stop and reflect on why we're doing the things that we do. So certain animals might just act out of instinct. There might be principles that are guiding their actions. Maybe a principle like, when I'm hungry, eat. But as rational creatures, we can stop and we can think about that principle that's guiding our action, and we can compare it to other maxims that we could adopt instead. All right. And then once we come up with these different maxims, we can imagine a world where our maxim becomes universal law and determine whether willing such a world would lead to a contradiction or not. By reflecting on the different maxims, not only that maybe we naturally follow, but the ones that we could follow, and then reflecting on what they mean and their implications, we can thereby choose to either follow these maybe instinctual principles or choose to live by a different principle. We can resist these maybe natural urges we feel. Maybe there's this natural principle of, when I'm hungry, eat. But if we have other kinds of goals, for instance, we might think, well, look, maybe a different principle would help me achieve those goals better. Moreover, it's actually because we are rational creatures, because we have this faculty of reason, that the moral law applies to us. If we did not have a faculty of reason, we wouldn't be morally obligated to act one way rather than another, because these commands of morality come from reason itself. The principle of universalizability is also intimately connected to the idea of autonomy. So autonomy is this power or ability to control our own lives and to self-govern the principles by which we live. So now Kant thought there was a deep reason for thinking that morality depends on the maxims of our actions, as proposed in the principle of universalizability, rather than the consequences of our actions. And that's because Kant thought that people can only be held morally responsible for things that are fully within their control. If someone has an epileptic seizure and during the epileptic seizure their fist hits someone in the face, well, that was something completely out of their control. It would be wrong of us to blame them for that. Morality doesn't apply, according to Kant, to things that are just out of your control. And he thought the consequences or results of our actions are often out of our control. We don't get to decide or choose what the results of our actions will be. But he thought we did have the power to choose what maxims we live by. So we can choose what we aim for and how we aim for it. Now, we might aim for something really good. We might adopt a very good maxim to live by, but due to factors that are completely out of our control, it might result in very bad consequences. Kant thought, well, we can hold you responsible for that principle you are living by, since you got to choose that, but we can't hold you responsible for those results, since those are largely out of your control. And moreover, it's important to note here that we can understand, it's our reason that allows us to understand the categorical imperatives of morality that apply to us, but these imperatives do not determine our maxims or actions. So we can know what morality demands of us, but it's still within our power to choose to actually do what is morally required. I want to pause here just for a second to help make sure that students avoid a confusion that I've noticed is often made when I teach this. Students often confuse this idea that people have the power to choose the maxims they live by. So Kant accepts that idea. But they confuse it with this idea that people somehow have the power to choose which moral principles apply to them. Kant rejects that. You have no control over what is moral and what is immoral. So maxims are these subjective principles of actions that people give to themselves, that they choose to utilize to guide their actions. And different people can choose to adopt and act on very different maxims in their lives. The maxims that guide my behavior, that I choose to live my life by, might be very different than the maxims that you choose to live your life by. But morality and the moral imperatives, so not the maxims now, but the imperatives, the commands of morality, are objective commands of reason. And these will apply to every rational creature equally. So the demand of morality applies to both me and you insofar as we both have reason. We don't get to choose these moral imperatives. We don't give these imperatives to ourselves. They come from our reason. Now, we might act on different maxims, and that could be fine as long as our maxims, even though they might be different, as long as they still obey the categorical imperative. So yes, you can choose the subjective maxims that you live by. However, if you choose to adopt a maxim that violates the objective moral imperatives, that violates the principle of universalizability, if you choose to live by maxims that are not universalizable, well then you're just choosing to be immoral on Kant's view. Right. Now, there are some advantages of this principle of universalizability in Kantian ethics here that I want to make sure to stress. So firstly, the principle of universalizability seems to improve on the golden rule. So the golden rule is this idea that you ought to do unto others as you would do unto yourself, as you'd have done unto yourself. So treat others the way you want to be treated. Now, that sounds nice, and it's very similar to the principle of universalizability insofar as it seems to be asking you to treat others in a consistent way. But there's a big problem insofar as it understands that consistency in a way that depends upon a person's own desires and preferences. So the golden rule would actually make morality subjective. Because imagine the masochist who maybe wants to experience pain and suffering. Well, if they want others to do that to them, well then the golden rule says it's perfectly okay for them to do that onto others. And so morality now depends upon what a person wants, desires to have done to themselves. But desires are different from person to person, and so morality would be different from person to person. The principle of universalizability doesn't do that. It depends upon whether the maxim is something that could be universally willed, whether there's any contradiction in applying that maxim universally. That is an objective matter, and it doesn't depend upon what your desires or preferences are. All right, now, another nice thing here is that good luck doesn't make an evil action permissible. If a person goes out and kills someone because they thought it would help them let off steam, well, that seems completely and utterly immoral. But imagine that it just randomly turned out that the person that they killed was a terrorist and they saved thousands of lives by doing this. Somehow it led to very good results. The principle of universalizability makes sense of why, look, that doesn't justify the action because that was just a matter of good luck. The maxim that was underlying that action was still not universalizable, and so the action was still immoral even if it happened to luckily lead to these good results. And similarly, there's this idea that bad luck doesn't make a good action immoral. When someone is trying to do a good thing, when they're trying to help others, and they do something that would usually lead to very good results, like maybe I see that there's an older person that's having difficulty walking, so I help them walk across the street to try to help them not get hurt. But imagine that as I'm doing that, unbeknownst to me, someone flies around the corner in their car and runs into us, and the older person dies as a result. That's just a matter of really bad luck. And it doesn't seem right to hold me responsible for those very bad results. It doesn't seem like my action was wrong due to this thing that was completely out of my control. Kant can explain why. He says it's not the consequences that determine whether trying to help this older person across the crosswalk was right or wrong. It's my maxim. And my maxim was still universalizable, even though I got put in a situation where, due to just bad luck, that very good maxim ended up leading to bad results. It also avoids problematic cases of severe injustice that caused worries for utilitarianism. Remember that organ harvesting case. The doctor's maxim seems to be something of the sort, kill a healthy person when I can save more lives by doing so. Well, that maxim doesn't seem to be universalizable, which we talked about in the last video for why. And so the action is wrong even though it leads to better overall results. Even if what the doctor is trying to get, even if the goal of the doctor is admirable and good, the means to achieving that goal are not acceptable because the maxim underlying that action is still not universalizable. It also makes room for partiality towards friends and family, unlike utilitarianism. Because the idea here is, imagine a maxim that says something like, help my friends and family first when they need it. You could universalize that everybody adopt that maxim, where they will help their own friends and family when they need it before a stranger. There's no contradiction in willing that everybody follow that maxim, and so that maxim is perfectly acceptable, and I can act on it. It also avoids worries about demanding difficult calculations. If the consequences are irrelevant to the morality of my action, I don't need to try to determine and do all these calculations of, well, if I do this, then that'll lead to that, then that'll lead to that, but there's also these other consequences. I don't need to do those calculations. I can just think about what my own maxims are, my own intentions, my own reasoning, and then think about whether or not those are good maxims or not. It also makes room for supererogatory actions. So remember, there is a duty to help others in need, but that's an imperfect duty. I cannot rationally will a universal maxim such that nobody ever helps anybody in need, because that would contradict my own rational will of willing that I get what I need. It's immoral for me to never help anybody else, but in order to avoid that immorality, in order to meet my duty of beneficence, I only need to help other people sometimes and to some extent. And so I can go above and beyond what is demanded by reason by not just helping them to some degree, but helping them to a very large degree. And now lastly, it also explains why the moral law wouldn't apply to at least many animals. So imagine a lion escapes from the zoo and a young child is killed. Now that's a very tragic and terrible thing, but it seems like it's very different than when another human being kills a child. The lion doesn't really know that what it's doing is wrong. The lion doesn't have the capacity to reason in that kind of way. And if it doesn't have that capacity to reason about its maxims and thereby choose what maxim it's going to live by, the idea is, well, then reason doesn't make any demands of that lion. The moral law does not apply to the lion. So we won't blame the lion when it kills. Now, we might try to stop the lion from killing because it's a very bad thing, but we wouldn't blame the lion in the same way we would blame an adult for doing the same thing. All right, so that's all for this video. I'll see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.